Hello, welcome. We're into week 12, the second to last teaching week in regards to looking at sociology. We're looking at chapter 7, social stratification in Canada. So first we're going to begin with what is social stratification, and we'll subdivide that into really two kind of categories, the class system or the caste system. And that'll make more sense when we show the difference between the two. Then we're going to look at the sort of inequity in Canada when we look at it in terms of income and wealth inequity and see what the differences between those two are. They're not exactly the same. And then we'll look at our sort of more classical perspectives about inequity and social class in Canada. And that's what we're going to do this week. And so this is an important topic, certainly as we've recently had our election, of course, and so that's going to affect some of the decisions that's going to impact social stratification in Canada. And so it might be an interesting thing to keep in mind in retrospect is what decisions did you participate in making in terms of your election choice, and what role did they play in the perspective about social stratification and income and wealth inequity. Well, good luck with this particular chapter. This is an interesting chapter. It's something we don't all have immediate and direct effect with, and yet for many of us we do. So good luck.
Okay, we're going to look at social stratification, and by definition, social stratification is a hierarchical arrangement of a large social groups based on their control over basic resources. Now, slavery, as an example, is an extreme form of stratification in which some people are owned by others. And this is more likely in a closed system where people are designated as slaves or treated as property and have little or no control over their lives. Now, we don't generally see too much of that in today's world, certainly not in North America, but it does happen in other parts of the world. Now, some people might treat, the stratification between the rich and the poor is kind of like this image here. Now, in this topic, life chances is really important because it refers to the extent in which individuals have access to important societal resources such as food, clothing, shelter, education, healthcare. This all comes from Faber. And the more affluent in our society tend to have better access to these life changes. Now, we can look at social stratification by virtue of, well, are we stuck where we are, or do we have some ability to move through and up or across in terms of our society stratification? And so we do have social mobility, and this is the movement of individuals or groups from one level of a stratification in a system to another. And you're more likely to be able to do this in open systems. Now, social mobility can be intergenerational, and this is the social movement that is experienced by a family member from one generation to the next. So for example, your grandparents sat at one particular level of social stratification system, and then by virtue of your grandparents to your parents, and then maybe to you, there's been an increase or a movement upward, or for that matter, downward in the intergenerational mobility on the social stratification system. Now, the alternative way is not inter, but intragenerational. And this is the social movement that you as an individual can earn in your own lifetime. So rather than going from one generation to the next, this is the movement through the strata. So for example, if you were living in a lower income family, and then by virtue of getting additional education and going on and living a life that would put you into a higher level on the stratification, perhaps middle class or upper middle class, that would be intragenerational mobility. Now, I've mentioned open and closed systems already, and I'm going to touch base on the caste and the class system. Now, the caste system is a system of social inequality in which a person's status is permanently determined at birth based on their parents' ascribed characteristics. So a closed system of social stratification. You don't get to move up and down. Now, for example, in India, this exists there, and it's based on occupation. In South Africa, it's based on racial classification. Now, this system, caste, does not exist in Canada. In fact, the system that exists is more open, and it's called a class system. And it's a type of stratification based on the ownership and control over resources, on the type of work people do. So it's more open than the caste system because the boundaries between classes are less distinct than the boundaries between caste. And that is why it's open, is it enables you to move up and down in this class system. So there is horizontal mobility, and this is occurring when people experience a gain or a loss in a position or in income that does not produce a change in their place in the social system or the class structure. So you've changed jobs from one job to the next, and you haven't moved up and you haven't moved down. You've stayed horizontal, if you will, in terms of that mobility. Now, alternatively, we could have vertical mobility, which would move up, or for that matter, down in class structure. So when we think in terms of stratification, we think in terms of usually income, money, or in some terms we hear the term wealth. So let's just make a distinguish between wealth and income. Income is essentially the economic gain derived from your wages, salaries, income transferred from government aid, or ownership of property, whereas wealth, this includes property, such as buildings, farms, land, houses, factories, cars, as well as other assets such as money in the bank accounts, corporate stocks, bonds, and insurance policies. So one is much more tangible than the other. Income is money that you can carry around and exchange with one another, whereas wealth can include that, but it also includes things that you can turn into cash, like property. Now, economists enable us to understand how income and wealth is distributed in a society using income wealth quintiles. Quintiles is Quintiles. Each group is known as a quintile, contains 20% of the population. And in Canada, 20% of Canadians in the highest income receive 40% of income of all Canadians. So this next slide shows you these quintiles. Now these numbers are based on 1999, so it's not correct in terms of current income. However, it gives you an idea in terms of how economists look at overall society divided up into 5 groups of quintiles, 20% each, and how the income level is distributed. Now, you'll find in your textbook some examples. Now, in 2007, the wealthiest 20% of households received 70% of the total income. In that same year, the poorest 20% received 4%. So you sort of see the distribution of wealth and income across quintiles. The wealthiest in general are defined as those whose assets total, after debt payments, more than $250,000. There were 1.1 million households that claimed to be millionaire status in that year. That's in 2007. The combined wealth of Canada's richest families are over $68 billion. And so there's quite an income distribution between the lower incomes and higher income families. Now, the theorists have different views as to why that is. And I'm only going to look at a couple here. Karl Marx and the conflict theorists, well, they sort of view this in the typical way that they do view this, in the distribution, in terms of there's 2 groups. There's the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, and these were the people that consist of those who own the means of production. They own the land, they own capital, they're the owners of corporations and factories. And then there's the working class, or the proletariat. And those are people who must sell their labor to the owners in order to earn a living and to survive. So based on the job that I do, I get paid by somebody else who owns the business. So some other terms associated with the conflict theorist is alienation and class conflict. Now, alienation is the feeling of powerlessness, the disconnectedness from people and even from yourself and society, and that the argument from the conflict theorists is that the working class has a tendency, because of their connection only to their work in regards to making a living and giving up of their time in order to make that living, and it's not always a good living, that there's a sense of I don't have much control and I feel disconnected from the rest of society. I can't always afford all those things. Now, class conflict, this is the struggle between the capitalist class of them and the working class. The working class wanting more and struggling for more opportunity, more rights, more pay, and the capitalist class that is fighting to keep what they've got and distribute that through the rest of the working world at a lesser rate. Now, mechanization is partly part of the conflict perspective around it's reducing the cost of producing products, but also it contributes to widespread unemployment. The more we mechanize, so for example, in the car factory industry, they don't need people to work on the line. They use robots to do the job. And this creates a reserve army, the reserve army being unemployed workers who constitute a readily available source of cheap labor. Now, we can go on to Max Weber, and he introduces a few terms here, but we're going to look at that there's no one factor from Weber's perspective, like in looking at the economic division by Marx, as he defines class, that there are many factors such as culture, as well as access to important societal resources such as economic, social, and political power to contribute. He noted that multidimensional approach to studying of social stratification. Weber's multidimensional approach to stratification focuses on the interplay between wealth, prestige, and power as being necessary to determine a person's class position. So as we mentioned, for wealth, from Weber's perspective, is the link between class and life chances, resources to make choices, and he's divided them up into different groups, unskilled labor right up to rentiers. Now, we don't need to worry about all these individual terms, but we're trying to make a distinction that it's not just one single element from Weber's perspective. Power is the second, and this is the ability of people or groups to achieve their goals despite opposition for others. So people with a lot of money and a lot of resources can make decisions about their life, and then even decisions that affect other people's lives, even if they oppose it, and can still make it happen anyway. It doesn't matter that there's opposition. They have the resources, they have the income, they have the capital to make these changes. Where someone who is paying, is making low income, they're not as able to influence their life and their life outcomes. And then the third point, the third cylinder, is that of prestige, the respect with which a person or status position is regarded by others. Now, if you're a CEO, if you are an owner, then you hold higher status. Typically, people look to see you as being someone of more value than someone who owns nothing and struggles to exist. Weber's insight, current sociologists use the term socioeconomic status, used to refer to combined measures that attempt to classify individuals, families, or households in terms of factors such as income, occupation, and education determine class position. So there's the introduction component. I hope this has been helpful, and we'll start with the last part of this, the second part of social stratification, in just a moment. All right, well, good luck, and we'll see you next week.